Historians frequently justify their presentations by claiming their predecessors have unreasonably ignored or neglected their topic. So it is, I want to argue, with the pillaging of Saint-Lazare on the 13th of July, 1789. My predecessors devote little space to it. For most of them, the affair represents the breakdown of law and order in Paris, or it is a reaction to aristocratic food hoarding. Michelet, Jaurès, Mathias, and Sabour say nothing at all about the affair. Lefebvre, Rudé, Andres, and Doyle devote just a few lines to it. McPhee a few more, or Chama, with his invocation of corpulent monks sitting on immense piles of grain, descends into caricature. Paul Chauvet, in a monograph devoted to the July crisis that came out in 1946, deals with the affair by seriously downplaying the vandalism and justifying the seizure of the grains on the grounds the city's poor deserved it more than the excessively wealthy monks. In fact, the grain was not seized, as we shall see. Gaucho does better with a serious examination of the affair, but he, like almost everyone else, tries to rope the affair to the traditional historiography on aristocratic food hoarding. Although subsistence certainly mattered, pillaging had nothing to do with high prices or hoarding. At least the writers did not invoke high prices or hoarding for their actions. The affair was not a classic grain riot. There was no price fixing or attempts to prevent grain shipments from leaving the locality. Instead, grain was escorted from Saint-Lazare to the Allo-Blé, where the bread was sold at prices fixed by the municipality of Paris, not by the crowd. In effect, the complex sold some of its own grain on the day of the Great Riot, while officials hired even some of the rioters, of all things, to escort grain and flour from the complex to the official market. Finally, the crisis in Paris in July 1789 was a crisis over Necker's dismissal and a military buildup. Some of the affair was relevant to that, other parts were not. In other words, the pillaging of Saint-Lazare was more than that. Pillaging was certainly spectacular, but there was also a search for arms. There was the brothers' role in assisting government grain policy, and finally, the successful attempt to divert supplies intended for the military. Saint-Lazare was not just a monastery or abbey, as it is so often described. It was, more properly speaking, a convent, the term used at the time, and the headquarters of the Lazarists, a religious order founded by Saint Vincent de Paul in 1625. It had religious houses in most of Europe, but it was more than that. The main house of Saint-Lazare in Paris was instead a religious complex, within whose walls a very large number of activities were carried out. Its grounds were spacious and enclosed, with gardens, fruit trees, and pasture. It housed porters, a substantial staff, priests on retreat, and indigent patients in a small hospital. It trained seminary students and missionaries for France and abroad. It was the headquarters of the Lazarists, who had houses in most of continental Europe. In the tradition of a celebrated founder, Saint Vincent de Paul, it was heavily committed to poor relief, as were the Filles de la Charité, also founded by Saint Vincent, across the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. Officials estimated that it was feeding 800 poor in the terrible winter of 1788-89, up considerably more than the normal contingent of 300 needy folk. The complex also lodged prisoners, debauched sons, errant priests, the mentally ill, and so on. The complex was also the center of one of the largest domains in the Ile-de-France. It owned many farms in the immediate suburbs and outlying villages like Gonesse. It owned land or seigneuries in Burgundy, Normandy, Auvergne, and the Beauce. It was landlord to a very large number of houses and buildings in northern Paris. It had seigneurial jurisdiction, even in criminal matters, over the bailliage of Saint-Lazare and La Villette. It owned woodlands in Neuilly. It collected quit rents on properties in the Rue du Paradis and the Rue Poissonnière. It was a major tithe collector, receiver of quit rents, annuities, regular rents, and transfer fees. It certainly received some of this income in kind, since there was a mill on the property. It dealt with a small group of merchants at the central market, the Allo-Blé. It was in constant contact with public officials like the Lieutenant Général de Police regarding sales of its produce. As with any other individual or institution in 1789, the public was suspicious that the complex was speculating in grain and flour. Rumors swirled around that the Lazarists were storing many weapons in their buildings, and that there were underground caverns where they stored grain to no good purpose. But when the electors of the Hotel de Ville and the magistrates of the Châtelet Court inspected the complex in June or early July, found just enough to satisfy its needs for 3 months, not a huge stockpile. It is doubtful, of course, in the frenzied atmosphere of fear and rumor over subsistence in 1789, this official declaration satisfied anyone. At first, Saint-Lazare managed its grain for its own purposes, but as supplies throughout the country from the disastrous harvest of 1788 dwindled, it got caught up in the government's and the courts' attempts to control the market. Inevitably, it was trapped between incompatible obligations to the poor in the neighborhood, to its staff and residents, to an increasingly hostile public opinion, and to the crushing demands of police and judicial authorities. Then go on to do some arithmetic here, which is difficult to do in this format, but let me say that they sold. They made the case in the summer of 1789. The Superior General made the case in the summer of 1789 that they were not hoarding. I go through the figures and demonstrate. I'm pretty convinced by that argument that they were not hoarding. In any case, the complex's market share was so small, somewhat over 100 centimes per month. Their decisions to hoard or sell would have had little effect on the price. In any case, the attack was not about hoarding, despite rumors that institutions and even the government were plotting famine as a device to force Paris to surrender. The official report drawn up after the attack mentions 2 groups of assailants, one arriving after the other in short order. The report provides no evidence that would identify either group, but we do have one eyewitness statement that is very precise and observant. Louise Carpentier, a widow who lived nearby, gave a different timeline than the report. The commotion woke her up. She opened the shutters. Her window gave her a direct view of the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. She watched the goings-on for the rest of the day. The first group arrived around 2:30 a.m. There were about 20 of them, with torches and armed with hatchets, hammers, and some firearms. 2 or 3 were French guards. Some were soldiers in white uniforms, meaning that they were from an infantry regiment. And others were civilians dressed en bourgeois. She heard a huge ruckus inside, including many gunshots. They broke down the main door of the complex. According to another witness, Nicolas Guidé, a domestic living in the prison, 4 French guards and 50 others threatened to kill him if he failed to open the gate of the prison. They demanded food, drink, and money. They also released the prisoners who wandered around the grounds and nearby streets for the rest of the day. The first set of invaders left around 5 a.m., shouting, "Allons au Palais Royal." This group was probably searching for arms. Significantly, they did not carry away any loot. Madame Carpentier saw them disappear to the south in the direction of the Palais Royal. Thus, Saint-Lazare was one of many religious institutions in Paris that were searched for arms. Such searches are part of the standard narrative, the one directed from the Hotel de Ville to the Palais Royal, the one Necker's dismissal set in motion. Other things happened at Saint-Lazare that do not fit this narrative very well. The official report of Madame Carpentier say the second group arrived shortly after the first, but she elaborated in greater detail. It was composed of men, women, and children. Madame Carpentier said that many of these people had been put to work in the charity workshops, the difference being that the riot occurred because the brothers had not been charitable enough in such hard times. Another witness agreed with this assessment and continued that she saw many market porters, but she did not know the names of any of them. These people had nothing to do with defending Paris from military attack. They took advantage of the breakdown of law and order to express a violent anger at the complex, but they also wanted food. "Allons chercher du pain," the second group shouted. Within an hour, they had stolen 400 loaves of bread from the bakery. They also vandalized and pillaged with impunity, despite the proximity of the French Guards' Nouvelle France barracks. The soldiers of the French Guards stationed there clearly acted on their promise made earlier not to fire on the people. There would be no repeat of the way the Réveillon rioters had been repressed. In the end, the hastily formed milice bourgeoise scattered the Saint-Lazare rioters. Soldiers and police never appear in the narrative. The destruction and looting this second group unleashed was enormous. Portraits of recent kings, popes, cardinals, bishops, abbots, and magistrates were ripped from the walls of the refectory and shredded. Cash, silverware, and plate were stolen. The assault was also an assault on intellectual and cultural capital. Telescopes, microscopes, pneumatic pumps, a machine électrique, and a collection of precious stones were stolen or smashed. The library consisted of 50,000 books, and many of these, along with ancient manuscripts, were torn from the shelves, ripped up, and flung through the windows. Legal documents, account books, titles, and declarations from censitaires in villages now completely built over, like Belleville, Montreuil, and Fontenay, were trashed. Hundreds of registers and boxes of papers and parchment, some dating from the 13th century, were similarly destroyed. Chairs, windows, and the organ in the chapel were badly damaged or wrecked. Sheep were hacked to death and trees chopped down. The granary was set alight, and there were small fires of documents everywhere. A huge amount of wine stolen or drunk. And I have the figures here, but just give you one indication of how much. 20,385 liters of Burgundy, meaning 5,400 US gallons. The loss from the wine cellar alone was estimated at 22,700 livres, enough to keep nearly 50 Parisian working class families alive for a year. Religious objects were also stolen and destroyed. Chalices, altars, pulpits, etc. One souvenir hunter even stole a skeleton, possibly a relic, more likely a mannequin for teaching purposes, and hauled it up 4 flights of stairs in his rooming house. It was obviously worth having, since the brothers got it back. The statue of Saint Vincent de Paul was especially targeted. They smashed hands as if to prevent the state from blessing the faithful or making a gesture of welcome. They mutilated the body as if to punish it. This would happen just a day later with the governor of the Bastille. Similar thing. They lopped off the head and paraded it about the streets. As with the mannequins of the Réveillon Fair and during the destruction of Bellière Blanche just hours before, vandalism of a statue or effigy was a punishment, an act of justice, a retribution, a warning, a long-awaited triumph. The third intervention, Madame Carpentier watched in horror as large fires ignited outside the grounds, and crowds set fires in the street, notably in front of the apothecary and the prison. By nightfall, many rioters were drunk or passed out against the walls of the complex. The third intervention involved transporting grain from the complex to the Allée. This was the decision on the part of the superior general, very likely to forestall any pillage on the part of the rioters. According to Madame Carpentier herself, the brothers, still in their costumes and 4-cornered hats, loaded grain and flour into carts for transport to the Allée. Brothers thus sold, in a careful accounting, 616 sack of grain and flour. That's to say, 3,700 bushels on the market. There may have been some coercion in these sales as well. Sister Juliette, a fille de la Charité from across the street, confirmed that 7 or 8 carts containing flour from Saint Lazare were taken to the Halles on the 13th by, as she said, order of the bourgeoisie, and that when these men returned on the 14th to retrieve their flour, they were sporting green cockades, the color of the Patriots at the Palais Royal. They also said they were for the Third Estate and asked passers-by if they were too. Some of the grain may not have come from Saint Lazare at all. Throughout the day, there were carts full of grain and flour moving down the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. According to François Rudé, an official at the complex, these grain carts apparently came from outside Paris and were destined for the École Militaire, that is the Champ de Mars, where many troops were stationed. This was part of the military buildup the Patriots feared and part of the plot to subvert the capital. Preventing the supply of these troops thus made strategic sense. The Patriots seized the carts and took a roundabout route to the Allée, shouting to cheering onlookers that the grain had come from Saint Lazare. Rudé and a companion who had been forced onto the carts were booed by a hostile public who threatened to hang them. The next day, the bourgeois escorted all the remaining flour in the complex to the Allée. Louis Pavard was one of those carters who took flour to the Halles. Brigands, he called them, most of them drunk, he said, threatened him and his horse. Along with about 15 other carters, he took 15 sacks of flour to the Halles. Made one other round trip and was paid 40 sous each time. Among the brigands, as they call it, were a French guard, a dragoon, and soldiers from other regiments. It certainly makes it look official. The testimony of Jean Quatreau, shows that this removal of the grain and flour to the isle was orderly and organized. He reported, notably, there were French guards and Swiss soldiers who were working like other individuals in the granaries to measure and load the grain. He did this for no pay, apparently. Although there was no loss of life, novices, boarders, and prisoners, some of them aroused half naked in their night clothes, ran into the streets terrified. The rioters released the prisoners who escaped, as well as 15 mentally ill men, all held by lettres de cachet. All the recorded fatalities had been assailants. Afterwards, there's a very considerable number of corpses. Even those of pregnant women were found drowned in the wine cellar or poisoned in the apothecary for having mistaken medicine for alcohol. Clearly, pillage and vandalism motivated some of these rioters. Although the archival sources are thin in this issue, and although contemporaries were determined to ascribe rapine alone as the motive, other issues emerge. For some of the raiders, the issue was a search for arms. This, in turn, would link the Saint-Lazare affair to the crisis over the sacking of Necker, especially to the broader search for arms that included other religious houses throughout Paris. Authorities' denial of grain and flour hoarding revealed a great deal of the rumor mongering preceding and following the assault. They denied that huge quantities were being held in underground storage. That stores far exceeded normal requirements, that the complex was speculating. Very unlikely, as we have seen. Perpetrators also had a human face. Of the 23 arrested, 16 were wage earners. The rest were largely petty artisans. Some, like Jean-Louis Cadet, were very down on their luck. He was illiterate. At 35, he was rather old still to be an apprentice butcher, and he was recently homeless as well. Almost all the arrestees were from the neighborhood, from the cramped streets off the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis and the Rue du Paradis. Employment in these hard times was very fleeting. 2 were boarding house keepers who watched over a transient population of younger men. Many were middle-aged. Others, arrested with stolen property, clothing, rare books, buckles, embroidered serviettes, a bolster, all kinds of useless stuff, were young, a long way from home in the provinces, never masters in their trade. One was a hired hand in a charity house, pretty dodgy job. Lodging in a boarding house or furnished room, or even moving every few days. Only one, when he was age 13, was living with family. Commentators allege profound ingratitude since they had apparently benefited from the complex's poor relief or had been employed there. Thus, like the Réveillon rioters, many were harder up than a simple listing of their occupations might suggest. Many, in fact, were destitute. The stunning degree of destruction shows that, like the Réveillon rioters, they were striking out hatred and redressing earlier humiliations. Unfortunately, we lack the details of these daily tyrannies. Some remarks are possible. There were no French guard or other soldiers or bourgeois among the arrestees. This suggests the authorities did not object to the initial breaking into the complex to search for arms, or to the subsequent removal of flour and grain. Punishment was reserved for vandals, who, contrary to what the authorities assumed, did have aims of their own, even if they're not too clear to us. It's hard to miss the desire to destroy the whole institution. At least part of it was about justice. In the case of St. Vincent, the statue, the perpetrators were removing the totemic power of hands or fingers of inanimate objects that blessed, welcomed, and comforted. The head of St. Vincent played a similar role. St. Vincent was transferred into an effigy, a warning of dire things to come. In both cases, representations were paraded around before awed spectators as a triumph. The parading of real heads in the next few weeks conveyed a message and a warning of justice triumphant. For the patriots, men of the Hôtel de Ville and subsequent journalists, the rioters at the customs posts and Saint-Lazare were the other. No one took up their defense. They were bandits and pillagers. Gens sans aveu, said the journalist Proudhon. One pamphleteer achieved this othering by distinguishing between people and populace. The city was given over to the populace, which grew at every moment, he wrote. The tocsin, or church bells, sounded all night. Frightening brigandage. They burned barriers and pillaged the followers of Saint-Lazare. Day soon revealed the populace had committed the greatest of disorders. It was not the people of Paris who pillaged Saint-Lazare, claimed one early historian. People of Paris fight for liberty, for honor, not for brigandage and theft. That afternoon, some pillagers became victims of a vigilante justice. People of Paris, so ennobled by other writers, hanged several bandits on the spot. The Comte d'Acheny reported that the militia captured around 20 vandals. He wrote, "These unfortunates, of whom several were mutilated, meaning were they criminal, perhaps branded as convicted criminals, plunged into drunkenness and covered in blood, drags, and crimes, were a hideous spectacle to see." He continued that since the prisons were overflowing, those caught red-handed were executed. The distinction between people and populace served to delegitimize popular actions. This included not only the Saint-Lazare affair, but also the Réveillon riots, the burning of the customs post between the 10th and the 16th of July, and finally the most ignored event in this type of action, the attack on the prisons, with the release of prisoners, particularly from the Châtelet and prison of La Fosse. Whether this was the same crowd in all events is an open question, although the journalist Montjoie claimed that those who burned the customs post also attacked Saint-Lazare. Maybe so, but the broader point is that these incidents were all série. They have little to do with political and military crisis, nor did they contribute to solving it. Those who participated had their own aims, some of them not particularly noble. The degree to which the rioters identified with the patriot cause is hard to estimate. Clearly, those who came from the Palais Royal to search for arms did, and very likely those who carted grain and flour away from the complex and from the Rudé Faubourg Saint-Denis were contributing to the public welfare. Both groups were contributing to the broad defense of the capital. But whether the pillagers were is another matter. Practically nothing in the record. One might have expected more if there were seditious slogans, since prosecutors took such shouts as aggravating the crime. And one exception is the testimony of Monsieur d'Ange, whose wine shop was visited throughout the day. Most customers paid for the drink, but one small group did not, claiming that they were working for the Third Estate and that it was the Third Estate who should pay him. For such people, the Third Estate, in quotation marks, or even the revolution itself, was remote. Thank you.
Qui attend